Thanks so much, Lynette. So I'll start by talking a little bit about my professional journey and then talk about the social welfare system in Hong Kong. So I hold two passports. I have a Philippine passport and a Dutch passport. Growing up, I spent time in Hong Kong and studied to be a lawyer in the UK. My father was a lawyer and politically active against the regime of President Marcos. He was afraid to be in the Philippines during the martial law years, but luckily he did not have to claim refugee status because he sought alternative protection through study and work visas abroad. My childhood was spent moving between different countries. In the UK, I was drawn to human rights and refugee law, and from 1994 I worked in various immigration and asylum law firms, representing people from countries including Somalia, Ethiopia, Turkey, Kosovo, Rwanda, Kenya, Congo, Iraq, Iran, Algeria, and Colombia. It was an honor and a privilege to have refugees share their histories with me, and every day I learned from the courage and resilience they showed in circumstances where I doubt I could have survived. I came across cases where individuals did not feel safe enough to make disclosure of all the elements of their claim at the beginning of their case. This delay in turn had an income on the outcome of their asylum claims. One case I will always remember concerns a woman from Rwanda that I represented in the late 1990s. She had been in a mixed Hutu-Tutsi marriage and her husband was disappeared, but she survived the genocide and fled to the UK with her two daughters. We submitted her asylum claim and I thought I knew her well. Once she told me that she had woken up to find that her daughter had left for school without her key. She was so distressed by this that she rushed to her daughter's school with the key, only wearing her night dress. She said her daughter was furious for embarrassing her. It was 2 years after we submitted her claim that she suddenly disclosed that both she and her husband had been gang raped and hurt with bottles by militia in front of their children. We put in further submissions to the Home Office, supported by medical evidence, but the Home Office determined that she should get exceptional leave to remain rather than refugee status. While this offered protection from return, this result was devastating for her because the principle of being recognized as a refugee was critical to her. In retrospect, how could I have expected her to make full disclosure earlier when she had no psychological support from her pain and may well have been facing problems like unclean and unsafe accommodation, poor nutrition, lack of access to basic needs like clothing, toiletries, and sanitary products to keep her and her daughters warm, dry, and clean, and lack of medical treatment. While good legal advice is important, this must go hand in hand with psychosocial support and social welfare assistance. It is necessary to be aware of and understand the intersection of all parts of a person's experience to help them have a chance to recover fully. I recently came across a report by Freedom of Torture called The Poverty Barrier, which dates back to 2012, but is still applicable today. It is the most comprehensive study to date of the experience of poverty among torture survivors in the UK. Among other conclusions, the report finds shocking levels of poverty among torture survivors during and after their passage through the UK asylum system. How the day-to-day struggles of living without the means to meet basic living needs reinforce the powerlessness and fear which is the torture survivors' inheritance from their past, and how poverty and powerlessness impede the realization of torture survivors' right to rehabilitation guaranteed under international law. No doubt these findings could be applied equally to survivors of torture living in the different jurisdictions where we all work. When I moved back to Hong Kong in 2002, I started to gain an understanding of the situation of refugees in Hong Kong, and by comparison, the UK system, which had many problems, suddenly seemed a paradise. In Hong Kong at that time, the UN Refugee Agency was determining refugee claims in an RSD system that lacked transparency and the elements of a fair trial. There was no provision for legal advice, food, accommodation, education, or physical and mental health needs. I I came across refugees who were sleeping rough and severely malnourished, barely surviving from scraps they found at wet markets. I learned of an NGO called Christian Action, which had opened a drop-in centre for refugees in 2004. Their service users asserted a need for legal advice in their claims before the UN Refugee Agency. I began delivering legal advice in Christian Action and trained more volunteer lawyers in international refugee law rights and representation. We had much support from an academic and activist for refugee rights called Barbara Bond, who sadly passed away a few months ago, and other actors from the international refugee legal aid movement. It became clear that we needed to set up an independent organization dedicated to refugee legal advice work before the UN Refugee Agency. And in 2007, together with an amazing Canadian refugee lawyer called Jennifer Stone, we established an organization called Hong Kong Refugee Advice Centre, which was the predecessor to Justice Centre. There have been many changes since this time, and the situation in Hong Kong has developed significantly as a result of various court cases. We now have a government refugee status determination system, and there is also some health and social welfare provision. So briefly recapping from yesterday, what were the components of holistic rehabilitation? I think it wasn't just medical in this physiological sense of physical therapy, but there was also legal redress, for example, determining responsibility, obtaining compensation, or achieving policy statements or change. There was also a component of social welfare needs and psychological therapy. Turning to Article 14 of CAT, James Goldson went through this yesterday, but so signatories should, as a matter of practice, provide a full measure of rehabilitation to survivors of torture. The reality is often far from different, with numerous barriers in play that prevent survivors of torture from accessing the full suite of what should be available. International treaties like ICCPL, ICESCR, and the Refugee Convention also provide guidance as to what social rights may be considered priority in the context of rehabilitation. So talking about the context of Hong Kong, there is no concept of holistic rehabilitation in Hong Kong, and consequently there is much re-traumatization for claimants in the process. Social welfare exists, but at a very basic level, essentially trapping claimants in poverty. There is a rental allowance of 1,500 Hong Kong dollars, which is about 192 US dollars a month, and a food allowance of 1,200 Hong Kong dollars, about 153 US dollars. This means that claimants live in very difficult conditions. There's no means of topping up income. There's absolutely no right to work, even upon substantiation. And although permission to work may be granted at the discretion of the Director of Immigration, this is only for up to 6 months and needs to be renewed. Children under the age of 18 have access to local education, but the provision is limited. There is access to medical treatment, but there are serious gaps in provision for mental health support in the public health system. Another serious problem is that there's gaps in provision between arrival and when your claim is accepted, or at least accepted as having been made, and when you can make a claim to the Social Welfare Department, which means for months people are living without support. So in terms of progress in legal and civil society developments, there have been small steps, notably the case of GA versus the Director of Immigration. This case concerned a small group of recognized refugees and torture claimants who were seeking the right to work. It was held there was no right to work, but the Director of Immigration's discretion is not unrestricted, and forced destitution may constitute inhuman or degrading treatment in breach of the Hong Kong Bill of Rights. We also see services, civil society filling in the gaps, advocacy, the sector coming together to campaign and advocate, and litigation as drivers of change. So thanks all of you very much for listening, and we're moving now into a mapping exercise for best practice. So you'll see that we have kind of set up kind of basic rights in the table. So we were thinking that you could sort of talk amongst yourselves, maybe for about 10 minutes, thinking about the jurisdictions where you work, and see how these rights apply in your jurisdiction, the social welfare rights, and then we could feed back to the group and we'll fill in the table with you. So just spend a few minutes just talking about or thinking about these issues now, and then we'll come back to the group.
Okay, so for this mapping exercise, if people from the same countries can sit together just for the next 10 minutes and have a talk about what is available in your jurisdiction for survivors of torture, either identified survivors of torture or those who are seeking asylum as well. And if there's nothing available, what is available to expand the rights, or how can you argue that these rights should be expanded within that jurisdiction? Thanks. And we'll come back at 10 o'clock and take some volunteers to kind of talk us through what their discussion entailed. we'll draw this discussion together in just a couple more minutes, so if you wrap up what you're saying now.
45
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, let's draw this together now. Hopefully we've had some interesting discussions within the group. Sounds like it's still ongoing. Okay, can I get everyone's attention? Because we would love to hear from all of you, and it sounds like there were some fairly lengthy discussions and in each group, so it'd be great to share with the symposium as a whole. So would anyone like to share what they were discussing in relation to their own jurisdiction or anything, any interesting comments on this topic? I'm going to pick on the bigger groups first, if no one volunteers, because I did see that there was a lot of discussion going on. Looking at people, but no one's volunteering. That's around the country. Well, let's start, because safety in numbers, if I just pick on this group there, someone will... and then you can choose amongst yourself who would like to share with the larger group what was discussed and whether or not there was something substantive that you wanted to share.
Well, we discussed firstly the question of access to medical attention, and I was talking about the fact that my own experience, I've had cases where I've had traumatized client who was advised to go and get psychiatric care. So he went along as directed to the casualty unit at the hospital, who simply refused to make any appointment for him to be even examined by a psychiatrist, so that was a complete stop. We then discussed the question of housing, and we concluded that so far as we knew, none of our asylum seekers did not have a roof over their head. The quality of the roof is dubious. But then it has to be looked at in the context of Hong Kong society. There are a lot of poor Hong Kong people who are living in bunk beds and so on. So the asylum seekers put in that context, although their conditions are deplorable, they are sometimes not worse than the locals. We were told of one case where there were particular needs of a traumatized girl, and the family was given bigger accommodation. So there is something that can be done through ISIS for people. What else did we discuss? Are there any other points that we discussed? We discussed working as well. Now, refugees are not allowed to work, but we all know that quite a few of them do. And our observation is that the immigration department seem to be quite happy with this. As long as they're not told about it, they won't do anything about it. But the refugees could not exist otherwise. The accommodation is so low. So we think there is unofficially a policy of what the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve for, and occasionally they will make an example of someone. And that's about all we had time to discuss.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on that point where you said you had a client who was particularly traumatized or had a psychiatric condition, and it was extremely difficult to access any healthcare there. We have on the chart right to medical treatment, yes, but I agree with you, it's limited in the actual practical access to it. Does anyone have anything to share in that sense? You know, whereas the right is there, how do people actually access it? And when people try to go about it, you know, what are the practical barriers along the way? I certainly know when people try to access mental health in Hong Kong, it's exceedingly difficult, and it's not recognized as something. Yeah, and we do hear that when people have certain conditions, they're given an appointment 18 months out, and these are people with potentially tumours that are currently undiagnosed. So there is this sense of, look, there is a right to medical treatment, but what does it actually look like? Does anyone have anything to say about that, either coming from the jurisdiction or any other discussions on that particular point? Okay.
I think one of the things that is often a balance when people have rights is also what the rights of the general population is. So in Australia you have a free medical system. People, all asylum seekers and people from refugee background have the right to a medical system, and in fact also have specialised services. But if the general population is waiting 18 months for an assessment, it's considered to be reasonable that so does someone who's an asylum seeker, because it's a very careful political line about making sure some people don't get better treatment than the general population does. Does that make sense?
Actually, Tracy, I want to just wonder if you could share as well, because in Australia the situation is quite unique, and you mentioned to us, within the groups of asylum seekers and torture survivors themselves, there is a desegregation in terms of access.
Yeah. So people may or may not be aware, but Australia essentially has at least 4 categories and then subcategories of people who've sought asylum or refugee status. So Australia has predominantly been a resettlement country. So anyone who has an existing refugee determination or who's come through the asylum process and gets a refugee determination has, if they get a permanent residency visa, then they have equal rights to anyone else in Australia. So they have rights to housing, they have right to education, right through tertiary education as well, right to work, right to health. They have equal rights to anyone in Australia. So that's anyone who has a refugee determination. In the last few years, people who arrived by boat and got a refugee determination have been given a temporary visa. They do have rights to work, rights to housing, rights to welfare, but there are some limitations on rights to education. And it's tertiary education, so they don't get essentially the same access. They have to pay international fees, but they do have essentially rights across the board. If someone is still, so Australia classifies people into different visas. So if someone is still seeking asylum, they have the right to housing, they have the right to education for children, they have the right, most of them have the right to work, and they have the right to, all have the right to medical treatment. But it is a bit varied depending on where they are, and that's very complex. I'm not going to go into that. Now, if they have gone through an asylum process and found not to have engaged protection, that is, they're essentially an unsuccessful asylum seeker, then they're in theory supposed to depart. There are a lot of people in Australia who can't depart because they can't return to country of origin, and that's where they start not having rights. So essentially they generally have the right to work and the right to health, but not always, and some don't. And they don't get welfare other than the right to work. And then we have the people who are in detention, and that's a whole separate category. So most people in Australia, not in narrower manners, who are seeking asylum or in fact who have failed in their asylum process, live in the community, are not in detention unless they've found to have failed a character test, so they've committed a crime, for example. Yeah. Does that? So most people would have all of those rights, including right to welfare.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. It is quite a complicated segregation of various people in pretty much probably propelled by the same situation to end up in Australia, but due to circumstance seems to be...
Yeah, and I'm talking next, and I'll actually outline some of those differences. But Australia still processes about 18,000 people a year who arrive by plane. The difference is the political environment around people who arrive by boat. So that's the narrow manners.
Does anyone want to comment on the situation in Australia or share about what happens in their country, especially if your country is a country that produces people otherwise seeking protection, or where torture is happening in a more identifiable way within your country?
I wonder, Lynette, can we move to the Philippines, because it's also a convention country.
Philippines?
Is that okay if that is Filipino delegates?
Right, great.
You can use your mic as well, Gilbert.
Oh, yeah.
Just press the button.
Hello, good morning. I'm from the Philippines. So there has actually been 9 waves of refugees in the Philippines, dating back to the Russian Revolution, to the Holocaust in Europe, and up to the Vietnamese people and the Indo-Chinese people when there was a revolution, and up to the East Timor conflict with Indonesia. So there were 9 waves of refugees coming into the Philippines. And with respect, for example, to the Vietnamese boat people, about 400,000 of them have actually become permanent residents in the Philippines, although some of them opted to go to either Australia or Canada with the help of some Australian CSOs. And the Philippines is the first ASEAN country to be a party to the Convention on Stateless Persons. And in fact, last November 2012, our Department of Justice issued an ordinance with respect to the processing of stateless persons and refugees. And it actually gives them the right to counsel, a right to an interpreter, and a right to interview. And in fact, the Philippines actually declared that we're willing to accept Rohingya boat people, except that we're so far away from Myanmar, so they'd rather go to either Malaysia, to Pakistan, or Sri Lanka. But we have the legal mechanisms in place. But right now, I think the bigger issue in the Philippines are the internally displaced persons that we have because of the Marawi siege. And there's still an undergoing rehabilitation with respect to the Marawi city. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much for that overview of the people within the Philippines that are in need of the services. Other people from the Philippines, do you have any comments as to available social rights that you wish to share?
There is a lot when you look into the human rights. If you delve deeply and before you analyze the situation, and I guess you have accommodated them, they have a housing, best they can go to school free and go to public hospitals, work opportunities there. But the problem is that when they are being persecuted, like torture, they do not have the same treatment because nobody is focusing on that situation. Second, there might be different culture.
We have a different culture in each country, and I don't think that's why they stay in that place only. They do not go out. They do not mix with us. They have their own place, and so that's why when you do the human, this is good, but you have to do some analyzing in relation to that's true. They are all available. However, it's not as it seems very good at all. I'm not downgrading our country, but rather you have to analyze deeply what is needed, especially for victims of torture or being persecuted in their countries. And then, there was a time that they were asked to leave in the country because their country is welcoming them again. However, there is no, I think there was no, monitoring in in that situation in relation to who is being persecuted and who is not. Those who wants to go out in the country should leave, but those who are being persecuted or as tortured should stay, because that is part of the Convention Against Torture. And so I do not have the data, but I think that's one of our issues in relation to the refugees.
Thank you very much. I think what you said probably hits home for a lot of people in this room in terms of on the paper the rights are available, but what does it look like in terms of access? If you're a torture survivor, is there access to these rights, and is there access to that healing process? And the cultural barriers that you mentioned as well is real in every jurisdiction we work with in terms of the people who are trying to access these rights. So thank you very much. That was very valuable input. Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Taiwan. Would you like to speak?
So I think my colleague can add more. Actually, in Indonesia, we had a constitution that mentioned that everyone should have the same rights for housing, for right to health, and etc. But in fact, when it's implemented to others law and regulation, that only mention about the right for the citizen, so not cover for the refugees or for the asylum seeker. So for example, for the housing, actually for housing, there's a government regulation in 2016 that the government has an obligation to establish the detention house for the refugees or asylum seeker, and if there's not enough house, they should make like a temporary house for them. But if talking about the right to education, there's not mentioned in that regulation. Also for right to work, government will not allow them to work in Indonesia, even though we found some cases where they are working illegally. Right. But yeah, but the thing is, the government will not allow them to work in Indonesia. And for the medical treatment and others needs, like a right to access the water and the food and etc., the government will let them to the international organization who work for the refugees and the asylum seeker, like UNHCR, the IOM, or others organization. So the government will not take care about the medical treatment. Do you want to add some information?
Yes, recently on 2016, there is the government issuing the regulation, the presidential regulation, but it's not to rehabilitate or anything in a positive way. It's more about the internal security matters of Indonesia. So it's stipulated there are 4 kind of action that we are taking by the government, and that are finding the refugee and detention, detain them, and about the security and supervising. And so it's pretty much about security.
So it sounds like in Indonesia there's a real limitation, and the government really stepping away from the responsibility of providing any rights to people who are foreign nationals, and especially including people who are seeking protection in your country.
Yes, and that in the presidential regulation, it's also mentioned about the most vulnerable people, like disabled person and etc. And the one who have a health problem, but all of the fund, it leads to the IOM or someone else, the UN international body.
Thank you very much for that sharing. Anyone else? Taiwan.
So unfortunately, we still have not a refugee law. So whenever someone is seeking asylum in Taiwan, the Immigration Bureau will do a case-by-case determination based on a standards without knowing to anyone. So I think the decision would be arbitrary. But if an asylum seeker gets to stay and manage to get a permanent residence visa permit, then he will enjoy the same rights as a Taiwanese national. So we are now drafting the new refugee law, and along the process we also identified that there are some gaps between the Refugee Status Convention and the 2 covenants. So in the new law, we will adopt a national treatment standards set by the two